Ever since the last Gaiden game was released, I've been wondering what RGG's next step for the sub-series would be. A popular theory for a while was that these games would carry on Yakuza's beat-em-up legacy in the same way that Judgment once did, before some behind-the-scenes developments made the prospect of a third game less likely. And then it occurred to me, when it comes to experimental Yakuza spin-offs, we never actually got to see a proper third entry for any of these sub-series. We've had 2 Kurohyo games, 2 Judgment games, and 2 original samurai games in the form of Kenzan and Ishin. For one reason or another, the second release in a cycle would always be the cutoff point, and I believe that the same thing may happen to the Gaiden games, at least in their present form, considering past trends. Given that the main focus of this discussion will be the original Gaiden and Pirate Yakuza, you can expect a multitude of spoilers for them from this point onward, and while Pirate may be light on story beats that could heavily impact the main lines, I do advise you to familiarize yourselves with both before proceeding. As you may recall, Pirate decided to end its campaign with a to-be-continued type of message, rather than the usual type of conclusion screen we'd see for a story's ending, which, coupled with the prominence of Saejima as a supporting character in this game, and the fact he was also a playable character in the past, led many to speculate we would get a Saejima Gaiden after this entry. Now, while my enjoyment and support of the Gaiden games has been well chronicled on the channel already, even I'd say that there's a number of circumstances standing against such an entry being realized anytime soon. For starters, while Kiryu's Gaiden also ended on a to-be-continued screen, that game was stated to be a bridge between Yakuza 7 and 8 from its very first reveal, so the inclusion of that message made sense. By comparison, Hori Ryosuke's comments on Pirate Yakuza's use of the phrase wound up reframing the most recent iteration as more of a symbolic gesture, rather than a means of teasing the developments of a future sequel, spin-off-wise or otherwise. Beyond that, while the English namesake of these games may make it hard to believe, each of the Gaidens was designed to accompany a specific mainline as its side story, with Kiryu's entries serving that purpose for Yakuza 7, and Pirate serving that purpose for Infinite Wealth, further playing off the literal translation of the word Gaiden, meaning side story. So between that, and RGG commenting how they'd take 4 years in between their mainline entries, meaning LAD 9 would come no sooner than 2028, the prospect of another spin-off in the vein of Gaiden becomes far less likely, provided they don't start developing multiple side stories for a single mainline, or break the proximity of a future Gaiden's release date with that of the associated numbered entry. Then there's the question of the game's lead to consider. From a business standpoint, you'd be hard-pressed to find a protagonist for a Gaiden game with a popularity comparable to Kiryu's or Majima's, so your best option for a new lead, based on past character popularity polls, would be someone like Akiyama. But after that, we'd likely be back to square one, lest we went the route of alternate continuities by bringing famous deceased villains into the mix. Or if we started making smaller scale games for some of the turn-based party members and offered them a beat-em-up redesign. There's simply far too many variables to consider, which is why we might see some form of evolution on the Gaiden design philosophy, if not a complete overhaul of it in the future. In many ways, these types of games are an upgrade on the concepts laid out by mini-campaigns like the Majima Saga and the Kaito Files. And while the former is still a controversial entry for those who remember it, the Kaito Files, at the very least, did show a ton of promise. Between elaborating on a great fan-favorite character and offering more of the fun combat system from its parent game, the only 2 things hindering its success were the initial pricing and a lack of a New Game Plus. The actual flow of the campaign was pretty solid, which would apply to the Gaidens as well, had the latter not suffered from an increase in mandatory side content. Granted, when looking at the complete package, the Gaidens are still a net positive, and they've shown great improvements in the fields of exploration and enriching the mainline entries they're bound to, particularly in the world-building department. But in many ways, it feels like certain design choices and improvements from the mainlines and other large-scale projects have yet to make their way into this side continuity. As if a dedicated section of RGG, working exclusively on budget projects like the Gaidens, has yet to obtain the complete list of betterments that the core team had comprised through comparatively larger budget entries like Lost Judgment. So this begs the question, do we improve on the current premise of these games via a larger budget and more development time, or do we go back to making Kiwami entries in their place, leaving the Gaidens to the same fate as Kurohyo and Judgment before it? Admittedly, this is far from a win-win scenario, but taking these two extremes into consideration is mainly a case of prior pattern recognition. Looking at past trends, it really does seem like one spin-off series or concept just replaces another one. So while I personally adore all of these individual entries, I can see why certain fractions of the community would take greater issue with a particular entry type over another, if only due to viewing it as the reason why their favorite sequel may no longer come to pass. Having said that, there are plenty of other reasons as to why some of these spin-offs would never get a third entry, beyond the aforementioned conundrum. Kurohyo 2 was released in 2012, roughly 2 years before the system it was native to was discontinued. And given how much of that game's DNA was a direct result of said hardware, giving it an upgrade like the one from Yakuza 2 to 3 would have likely been more than the budget of the team back then could handle, especially with them still being all hands on deck with Yakuza 5 and later on Ishin and Zero. Speaking of Ishin, the idea of samurai games becoming a testing ground for new tech on a new console generation also felt like a promising formula in the long run. But given how the team was already toying around with the idea of retiring Kiryu at that time, and the success of Yakuza 0 opening up a brand new market for them, it meant that the viability of a new samurai spin-off in a similar vein would be dependent on a myriad of outside factors. Even if they had an outline for a third original samurai game, then the lesser sales of an entry like Ishin Kiwami in the West, and the mixed reception towards it in Japan, likely put the prospect of another entry much further down the priority list, if it's even there anymore. Lastly, the Judgment situation is frankly the most unfortunate of this group, considering the creativity and general improvements that were on display, but again, outside influences that we've discussed several times on the channel have made the prospect of a sequel far less likely. For all we know, this may be the biggest reason why the Gaiden games and Stranger Than Heaven were jump-started in the first place, the latter of which may actually be the solution we've been waiting for in more ways than one. Stranger seems to be getting the treatment and quality assurance of a proper Yakuza mainline, and the myriad of new assets feels like everything we'd originally noticed in something like Judgment's trailers, but ramped up even further. Considering how much of an undertaking projects like these are, and how RGG always works on several games at once, my guess is that the time frame after Stranger Than Paradise's release will be the thing that many critics in the community are hoping for. With this game finally complete, the programmers involved will end up moving on to different projects, which would mean more polish for a future spin-off, whether it's a new Gaiden or an evolution on its core intent, as was shown in the jump from the Kaito files to where we currently are. To add to this, unlike with the other spin-offs, Gaiden games generally have less hurdles to overcome in terms of writing up an original story and doing the casting. There are no agency complications like the ones tied to Judgment's lead, no generational gaps like in the case of Kurohyo, and no historical or sales stipulations like with the samurai spin-offs. The only thing preventing these games from their peak is the current self-imposed boundary on the development time and budget, which should cease to be an issue once the core team is complete again after Stranger Than Heaven. But that's just my perspective on the matter. With all that said, let me know what you think about the future of Gaiden. Do you think it will undergo an evolution like we just theorized, or that we will get something completely unexpected in its place? Either way, thank you for listening, as always. So, until next time, take care of yourselves, and have a great day. Cheers!